Hajin wiped the sweat from her forehead as she worked on the navigation system in the engine room of the Starbound Unity. The massive ship hummed around her with the sound of 1,000 different alien technologies working together. She had been fixing problems on this ship for 3 years now, and still felt like an outsider among the crew. Most of the aliens who worked here thought humans were strange creatures from a dangerous world. They called her people Deathworlders, and whispered that humans were too violent and unpredictable to be trusted with important jobs. The navigation console beeped with an error message that made Ha-Jin frown. She had seen this warning before, but never this severe. The ship's path through space was becoming unstable, and the computer could not find a safe route forward. They were getting close to the Krava Nebula, and everyone knew that space was dangerous. Ships that went into that area often disappeared forever, and no one knew why. "Hey, Ha-Jin," called Do-hyun from the doorway. The human medic looked worried as he walked over to where she was working. "The captain wants to see you on the bridge, right away." "Something about the navigation problems we have been having?" Ha-Jin felt her stomach drop. Captain Taerim was a Velthari with scales that changed color when he was angry. His species looked like giant snakes that walked upright, and they thought they were better than most other aliens in the galaxy. Taerim especially did not like humans and made no effort to hide his feelings about having 3 of them on his ship. She followed Do-hyun through the curved corridors of the ship. Other crew members moved out of their way, but Ha-Jin noticed how they stared at her with their strange alien eyes. The Korthak engineers with their 4 arms crossed them when she passed. The floating ethereal navigators made clicking sounds. That might have been disapproval. Even the usually friendly Zephyrian traders seemed nervous around her today. The bridge was full of tension when they arrived. Captain Taerim stood in the center with his scales flickering between dark red and black. His long neck turned toward Ha-Jin and his yellow eyes fixed on her like she was prey. Around him stood the senior officers of different alien species, all looking at her with suspicion. "There you are, Deathworlder," Taerim said in his hissing voice. "We have a serious problem, and it seems to trace back to your work on our navigation systems." Ha-Jin felt her heart racing but kept her voice steady. "Sir, I have been following all the proper procedures for maintenance. The navigation system has been running within normal parameters until today." "Normal parameters," Taerim repeated with what might have been laughter if snakes could laugh. "Your kind thinks everything is normal because you come from a world where nothing is safe. You probably damaged something with your crude human methods, and now we are all in danger." The other officers murmured agreement. Ha-Jin looked around for support, but even the ones who had been friendly to her before seemed to believe the captain. She spotted Bo-Ra, the human xenobiologist, standing near the back of the group. Bo-Ra caught her eye and shook her head slightly, as if warning her to be careful. "Captain," Ha-Jin said, trying to keep her voice calm, "I can run a full diagnostic on all the systems I have worked on. If there is damage, I can find it and fix it. Give me 12 hours and I will have everything working perfectly." Taerim's scales turned completely black now, and his neck stretched forward until his face was close to hers. She could smell his alien breath and see the sharp teeth in his mouth. 12 hours, he hissed. "Do you know where we are, Deathworlder? We are at the edge of the Krava Nebula. Ships that enter that cursed space are never seen again. If our navigation fails completely, we will drift into that death trap and become another mystery for future explorers to wonder about." The bridge fell completely silent. Everyone knew the stories about the Krava Nebula. Some said it was haunted by the ghosts of dead civilizations. Others believed there were creatures in there that fed on starships. The truth was that no one who entered had ever come back to tell what they found. "Sir," interrupted Do-hyun, stepping forward, "Ha-Jin is the best engineer we have. She has solved problems that stumped your other technicians. If anyone can fix this, it is her." Captain Taerim turned his attention to Do-hyun, and his scales began to glow with an angry red color. "Another Deathworlder speaks up for his packmate. How touching. But I do not think your friend here made an innocent mistake. I think she has been sabotaging our ship from the beginning." "That is not true," Bo-Ra called out from the back of the room. "Ha-Jin would never hurt anyone on this ship. She has saved our lives more than once with her repairs." 3 Deathworlders, Taerim said, looking around at his officers. 3 humans from their violent world now trying to defend each other. Perhaps they planned this together. Perhaps they want to take over my ship. Hajin felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Getting emotional now would only make things worse. Humans had a reputation for being hot-tempered and violent. If she lost control, it would prove everything Tayrim believed about her people. "Captain?" she said as respectfully as she could manage. "I have served on this ship faithfully for 3 years. I have never given you reason to doubt my loyalty. Please let me prove that I did not cause this problem." Tayrim considered her words, while his scales slowly shifted back to their normal gray color. The other officers waited for his decision. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was cold and final. "The navigation system is failing and we need someone to blame. Someone must take responsibility for putting this entire ship in danger. The crew needs to see that justice is done before we all die in that cursed nebula." Hajin felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what was happening. Tayrim was not interested in finding the real cause of the problem. He wanted a scapegoat, and she was the perfect choice. A human Deathworlder that most of the crew already distrusted. "I will not execute you on my ship," Tayrim continued. "That would be wasteful. Instead, you will be cast out to face judgment from the universe itself. There is a planet nearby called Zerion Prime. The escape pods can reach it easily. You will be sent there to live or die as fate decides." "Zerion Prime," gasped one of the ethereal officers. "Captain, that world is inhabited by the Rakthani. They are apex predators. She will be dead within hours of landing." Tayrim smiled, showing all of his sharp teeth. "Exactly. The Deathworlder who endangered our ship will face the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. If she survives, then perhaps the universe has judged her innocent. If not, then she got what she deserved." Duhyun started to protest, but Bora grabbed his arm. She whispered something in his ear that made his face go pale. They both knew that arguing further would only make Tayrim angry enough to cast them out too. Hajin looked around the bridge one last time. Some of the alien faces showed pity, but most showed satisfaction. They were happy to get rid of the dangerous human who had brought this trouble on them. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. If she was going to die, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg. "I understand, Captain," she said in a clear voice. "I will go prepare for my journey to Zerion Prime." 2 security guards escorted her to the escape pod bay. Dohyun and Bora followed at a distance, their faces showing the pain of watching their friend being sent to certain death. Hajin gathered her few personal belongings and some basic supplies. The pod had food and water for a few days and emergency equipment that might help her survive on an alien world. As she climbed into the small escape pod, she turned to look at her 2 human friends one last time. "Take care of each other," she told them. "Maybe someday you will find a better ship with a better captain." The pod door sealed shut, and Hajin felt the ship's launch system activate. Through the small window, she watched the starbound Unity grow, smaller as her pod flew toward the red planet below. Zerion Prime looked beautiful from space with its crimson forests and purple mountains. It was hard to believe that such a lovely world was home to the galaxy's most feared predators. As her pod entered the atmosphere and began its fiery descent toward the surface, Hajin wondered if she would live long enough to see the sunrise. The Rakthani were supposed to be 8 feet tall with armor like skin and claws that could cut through metal. They had never been conquered by any other species, and they killed for sport. But Hajin was human, and humans were survivors. Her people had crawled out of caves and built cities. They had sailed across oceans and flown to the stars. If the universe wanted to test her against the apex predators of Zerion Prime, then she would show them what a Deathworlder could really do. The escape pod hit the ground hard, and Hajin felt her teeth rattle from the impact. Smoke filled the small cabin, and emergency lights flashed red warnings about hull damage and system failures. She grabbed her supply pack and hit the door release button. The hatch opened with a hiss of escaping air, and she stumbled out onto the surface of Zerion Prime. The first thing that hit her was the smell. The air was thick with the scent of growing things and something else that reminded her of metal and danger. Tall red trees stretched up toward a purple sky, and strange flowers glowed with their own light in the shadows. Everything looked beautiful, but Ha-Jin knew that pretty things on alien worlds were often the most deadly. She had barely taken 10 steps from her crashed pod when she heard it, a low, growling sound that came from multiple throats. Ha-Jin turned, slowly, and felt her heart stop. 6 creatures stood watching her from between the trees. They were even bigger than the stories had said. Each one was at least 8 feet tall with 4 muscular arms ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. Their skin was covered in natural armor plates that shifted from dark red to brown as she watched. Yellow eyes stared at her with intelligence that was somehow more frightening than simple animal hunger. These were the Rakthani, the apex predators that had never been conquered. The hunters that other species used to frighten their children in bedtime stories. Ha-Jin forced herself to stay perfectly still. Running would trigger their hunting instincts, and she knew she could never outrun creatures built like these. Instead, she studied them the way her grandfather had taught her to watch dangerous animals back on Earth. She looked for signs of what they were thinking and planning. The largest Rakthani stood in the center of the group. This one had scars across its armor plating and carried itself with the confidence of a leader. Its yellow eyes never left Ha-Jin as it made a series of clicking and growling sounds to the others. She could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear. They were deciding what to do with her. One of the younger Rakthani made an aggressive movement forward, but the leader stopped it with a sharp bark. Ha-Jin realized that even apex predators had rules and social order. The young one was eager to attack, but it would wait for permission from the leader. She took a deep breath and made a decision that would either save her life or end it quickly. Instead of cowering or trying to run, Ha-Jin stood up straighter and looked directly at the leader. On Earth, staring at a predator was usually a bad idea, but these were not Earth animals. These were intelligent hunters, and they would respond to different signals. The leader tilted its massive head to one side as if surprised by her reaction. It said something to the others that sounded almost like a question. Ha-Jin could see their body language changing. They had expected her to show fear or try to flee. Her strange behavior was making them curious instead of simply hungry. The young Rakthani that had moved forward earlier made another aggressive sound. It seemed frustrated that the small creature was not acting like proper prey. Without waiting for permission this time, it lunged toward Ha-Jin with claws extended. Ha-Jin had been in fights before. Growing up on Earth meant dealing with bullies and dangerous situations. But she had never faced anything like this. The Rakthani was impossibly fast for something so large. Only her human reflexes and 3 years of working in the cramped spaces of a starship saved her. She threw herself sideways and rolled behind one of the glowing trees, just as the claws swept through the air where she had been standing. The young Rakthani roared in frustration and spun around to face her new position, but Ha-Jin was already moving again. She grabbed a fallen branch from the ground and swung it as hard as she could at the creature's knee joint. The wood shattered against its armored skin, but the impact was enough to make it stumble. The other Rakthani made sounds that might have been laughter or approval. Ha-Jin realized that the young one had acted without permission, and now looked foolish for failing to catch such small prey. In a society based on strength and skill, this was probably embarrassing. The leader barked another command and the young Rakthani stepped back. It looked angry but did not disobey again. Ha-Jin slowly stood up from her defensive crouch and faced the group. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst, but she kept her expression calm. The leader approached her slowly with its forearms spread wide. This could be a threatening gesture, or it might be showing that it carried no weapons. Ha-Jin decided to take the chance that these creatures valued courage. She walked toward the leader until they were only arm's length apart. Up close, she could see details that made the Rakthani even more impressive. Its armor plating was not just natural protection, but seemed to be decorated with patterns that might have meaning. Scars told stories of battles fought and survived. The yellow eyes held intelligence that reminded her of the smartest humans she had ever met. The leader reached out slowly with one of its forearms. Ha-Jin fought every instinct that told her to flinch away as a clawed hand touched her shoulder. The touch was surprisingly gentle for something that could crush her bones without effort. The leader made a series of soft sounds that might have been words. Another Rakthani stepped forward, and Hajin saw that this one was different from the others. It was slightly smaller, and its armor had different patterns. When it spoke, the sounds were higher pitched and more musical. Hajin guessed this might be a female of the species, though she had no way to be sure. The female Rakthani pointed toward the crashed escape pod and made questioning sounds. Then it pointed at Hajin and made more complex vocalizations. It seemed to be asking where she had come from and why she was here. Hajin pointed up toward the sky and made a swooping motion with her hand to show something falling. Then she pointed to herself and shrugged to show she had not chosen to come here. The female Rakthani tilted its head and made what sounded like understanding noises. The leader barked something that brought all the other Rakthani to attention. It pointed toward the forest and began walking. The others fell into formation around Hajin, but she noticed they were not treating her like a prisoner. They seemed to be protecting her from something. As they moved through the red forest, Hajin began to understand why they were being careful. Strange sounds came from the shadows between the trees. Things moved in her peripheral vision that disappeared when she tried to look directly at them. The Rakthani kept their claws extended and their heads turning constantly to watch for threats. They came to a clearing where Hajin saw her first Rakthani settlement. It was not what she had expected. Instead of crude shelters, she saw sophisticated structures that seemed to be grown rather than built. The buildings curved and flowed like living things, and were covered in the same glowing patterns she had seen on the trees. Other Rakthani emerged from the structures to stare at the strange visitor. Hajin saw young ones that looked like smaller versions of the adults and older individuals whose armor had taken on different colors with age. They all moved with the same deadly grace, but she could see curiosity in their expressions. The leader brought her to the center of the settlement, where a particularly large structure dominated the space. An ancient Rakthani emerged from this building, and Hajin knew immediately that this was someone important. The old one's armor was almost white with age and covered in intricate scars that told the story of countless battles. All the other Rakthani made respectful gestures when the elder approached. Hajin decided to do the same and bowed her head, slightly. The elder made an approving sound and began to speak in the complex language of its people. The conversation went on for some time, with the leader explaining what had happened and the elder asking questions. Hajin could not understand the words, but she watched their body language and began to pick up meaning. They were discussing what to do with her and whether she posed a threat to their community. Finally, the elder approached Hajin directly and looked her up and down with eyes that had seen decades of life on this dangerous world. It reached out and touched her arm, feeling the soft human skin and fragile bones underneath. Then it made a decision that would change everything. The elder called out in a loud voice that brought every Rakthani in the settlement running. When they were all gathered, it began to speak in formal tones that sounded like an announcement. Hajin could not understand the words, but she could feel the importance of what was being said. When the elder finished speaking, the other Rakthani looked at Hajin with new expressions. The hostility was gone, and in its place was something that might have been respect or at least acceptance. The young Rakthani that had attacked her earlier approached and made what looked like an apologetic gesture. The female Rakthani that had tried to communicate with her before came closer and began speaking slowly. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Sujin. Then she pointed to Hajin and made a questioning sound. Hajin understood. The Rakthani was telling her name and asking for hers in return. Hajin, she said clearly, pointing to herself. Sujin repeated the human name several times until she could pronounce it correctly. Then she began pointing to other Rakthani and saying their names. The young one that had attacked was called something like Minho. The leader was Hyunwoo and the elder was Jiwoo. As the Ali Hajin woke up to the sound of Rakthani voices raised in alarm. She had been sleeping in a shelter that Sujin had shown her the night before. The walls glowed softly with the same bioluminescent patterns she had seen throughout the settlement. Through the curved doorway, she could see Rakthani warriors gathering in the center of the community, with their claws extended and their armor plates shifting to darker colors that meant anger or fear. She walked outside and found Sujin standing, with a group of other Rakthani around something on the ground. When Hajin got closer, she saw what had upset them so much. It was the body of one of their prey animals, but something was terribly wrong with it. The creature's eyes had turned completely black, and its skin had a gray pallor that looked diseased. Worst of all, there were strange growths covering its body that pulsed with a sickly green light. Sujin noticed Hajin approaching and made urgent sounds while pointing at the dead animal. Even without understanding the language, Hajin could tell that this was not a normal death. The Rekthani were apex predators who feared very little, but whatever had done this to their prey was clearly something that worried them. Elder Jiwoo arrived and examined the corpse carefully. The old Rekthani made disgusted sounds and backed away from the body. Then Jiwoo began speaking in the formal tone that Hajin recognized as important announcements. The other Rekthani listened with growing concern on their faces. Minho, the young warrior who had first attacked Hajin, approached and tried to communicate using gestures and simple words. He pointed to the dead animal, then made sweeping motions toward the forest. Then he made fighting gestures and shook his head sadly. Hajin began to understand. Something was killing their prey, and the usual methods of dealing with threats were not working. Leader Hyunwoo organized the warriors into hunting groups, and they began preparing for some kind of expedition into the forest. Hajin watched them check their natural weapons and practice combat moves that were both beautiful and terrifying. These were creatures that had evolved to be perfect predators, but they were treating this hunt like they expected real danger. Sujin came over to Hajin and made gestures that clearly meant she should stay in the settlement where it was safe. But Hajin shook her head and pointed toward the forest. She had survived 3 years on an alien spaceship by making herself useful, and she was not about to start hiding now that real problems had appeared. The female Rakthani made frustrated sounds and tried again to convince Hajin to stay behind. But Hajin had noticed something that the Rakthani had missed. The dead animal showed signs of being hunted by something that attacked in groups. The bite marks were too small to come from Rakthani, but there were too many of them for a single predator. Whatever was out there hunted in packs. Hajin tried to explain this using hand gestures and crude drawings in the dirt. She showed multiple small attackers surrounding a single large prey animal. The Rakthani watched her demonstration with growing interest. They were individual hunters who sometimes worked together, but they did not think like pack animals. Elder Jiwoo approached and studied Hajin's drawings carefully. The old Rakthani asked questions using simple words mixed with gestures. Hajin drew more pictures showing how pack hunters could be defeated by working as a team instead of fighting as individuals. She showed tactics like surrounding the enemy and cutting off escape routes. The Rakthani had never seen strategies like these. They were used to relying on their individual strength and speed to overwhelm opponents. The idea of coordinated group tactics was foreign to them, but Jiwoo was old enough to recognize good ideas even when they came from unexpected sources. Hyunwoo called for the hunting party to gather, and Jiwoo explained what Hajin had shown them. There was some arguing among the warriors. Some of them did not like taking advice from the small soft creature who had fallen from the sky. But others remembered how she had avoided Minho's attack and began to think that maybe the strange visitor had useful skills. Finally, Hyunwoo made a decision. Hajin would come with the hunting party, but she would stay in the back where the warriors could protect her. If her ideas about pack hunting were correct, they might need her knowledge to defeat whatever was killing their prey. The hunting party moved into the red forest with Rakthani warriors spread out in a formation that Hajin recognized as good for individual fighters, but terrible for dealing with group attacks. She tried to suggest changes, but the warriors were set in their ways. They had been hunting like this for generations and saw no reason to change now. They found the trail of whatever had killed the prey animal. Strange tracks in the soft earth showed creatures about the size of large dogs but with too many legs and claws that left deep gouges in the ground. The tracks moved in organized patterns that confirmed Hajin's theory about pack hunting behavior. As they followed the trail deeper into the forest, Hajin began to notice other signs that the Rakthani were missing. Broken branches at a consistent height showed that the creatures moved through the trees as well as on the ground. Scratch marks on tree trunks were spaced in ways that suggested the creatures were marking territory. Most importantly, the tracks showed that they had been watching the Rakthani settlement. She tried to point these things out to Sujin, who was staying close to her during the hunt. The female Rakthani began to understand and started looking for the same signs. Soon Sujin was pointing out details that even Hajin had missed. Working together, they built a picture of intelligent predators that planned their attacks carefully. The trail led to a clearing where they found evidence of a major battle. The ground was torn up and covered with blood from multiple species. Some of the blood was from Rakthani prey animals, but some was from other creatures that Hajin did not recognize. In the center of the clearing was a pile of bones that had been picked clean. Hyunwoo examined the bone pile and made angry sounds. These were not just random prey animals. Some of the bones belonged to young Rakthani who had been hunting alone. The pack creatures were not just killing for food. They were targeting the apex predators themselves. While the Rakthani warriors focused on the bones, Hajin studied the battlefield from a tactical perspective. The way the ground was torn up told a story of how the fight had happened. The young Rakthani had been surrounded and overwhelmed by superior numbers. Their individual fighting skills had not been enough against coordinated pack tactics. A sound from the forest made all the Rakthani freeze. It was a chittering noise that seemed to come from multiple throats. Hajin felt her skin crawl as she realized they were being watched. Eyes reflected light from the shadows between the trees and shapes moved just at the edge of vision. The creatures that emerged from the forest were like nothing Hajin had seen before. They looked like a nightmare combination of spider and wolf with 8 legs supporting bodies covered in chitinous armor. Their heads had multiple eyes and mouths full of needle-sharp teeth. Worst of all, they moved with intelligence and purpose that showed they were not simple animals. There were at least 20 of them, and they spread out in a perfect surrounding formation. Hajin recognized military tactics in their movement. These creatures had been studying the Rakthani and learning how to fight them effectively. The Rakthani warriors prepared for battle in their traditional way, with each fighter choosing an opponent and preparing for individual combat. But Hajin could see this was exactly what the pack creatures wanted. They had learned that Rakthani fought alone, and they were ready to use superior numbers against isolated opponents. Hajin shouted and pointed, trying to warn the warriors about the trap they were walking into. Some of them looked at her with confusion, but Sujin understood. The female Rakthani called out to the others in their own language, explaining what Hajin was trying to tell them. Hyunwoo hesitated for a moment, torn between traditional fighting methods and the strange new ideas from the alien visitor. The pack creatures took advantage of his hesitation and launched their attack with perfect coordination. What followed was exactly what Hajin had feared. Individual Rakthani warriors found themselves fighting multiple opponents, while their allies were too far away to help. The creatures used hit-and-run tactics that prevented the Rakthani from using their superior strength effectively. Hajin watched Minho get surrounded by 4 of the creatures and knew he was in serious trouble. Without thinking about the danger to herself, she grabbed a fallen branch and ran toward the fight. She could not match the strength or speed of either species, but she understood pack tactics better than anyone else present. Instead of trying to fight the creatures directly, Hajin used the branch to break up their formation. She poked and prodded at them from unexpected angles, forcing them to turn and face her instead of coordinating their attack on Minho. The young Rakthani used the distraction to grab one of his attackers and tear it apart with his claws. Sujin saw what Hajin was doing and began copying her tactics. Instead of facing her opponents head-on, the female Rakthani started moving in ways that forced the pack creatures to get in each other's way. Soon other warriors began to understand, and the tide of battle started to turn. Elder Jiwoo had stayed back from the fighting due to age, but the old 3 months had passed since Hajin first arrived on Zerion Prime, and the Rakthani settlement had changed in ways no one could have imagined. The bioluminescent buildings now served as coordination centers where hunting parties planned complex operations instead of simple individual raids. Warriors who had once competed against each other now worked together using tactics that Hajin had taught them, based on human military strategies. But the threat they faced had also grown worse. The spider-wolf creatures that the Rakthani had started calling the Vex were not just random predators. They were part of something larger and more organized. Scout parties reported finding Vex colonies throughout the forest, and worse yet, Some of the infected animals were still alive, serving as hosts for parasitic creatures that controlled their minds and bodies. Ha-Jin stood in the center of the settlement, watching Su-Jin lead a training session for young warriors. The female Rakthani had become her closest friend and translator, helping her communicate complex ideas to others in the community. Su-Jin had natural tactical instincts that made her an excellent student, and she was now teaching coordinated, fighting techniques to the next generation. Elder Jiwoo approached with the slow, careful steps of someone whose age was finally catching up with them. The old Rakthani had been spending long hours studying maps and reports from scouts trying to understand the scope of the Vex threat. What they had learned was disturbing. Through gestures and the growing vocabulary of shared words that Ha-Jin and the Rakthani had developed, Jiwoo explained the situation. The Vex were not native to Zerion Prime. They had arrived from somewhere else and were systematically consuming the planet's ecosystem. Infected animals spread the parasites to other creatures, and the colonies grew larger every day. More troubling was the discovery that the Vex seemed to be specifically targeting Rakthani settlements. They had learned to identify the apex predators as the biggest threat to their expansion and were actively hunting them. 3 smaller settlements had already gone silent, and search parties found only empty buildings and signs of massive battles. Ha-Jin studied the crude map that Jiwoo had drawn showing the locations of known Vex colonies. The pattern was clear to anyone who understood military strategy. The aliens were establishing bases in a circle around the largest Rakthani settlements and slowly tightening their grip. Soon they would have enough forces to launch coordinated attacks that even the improved fighting techniques might not be able to stop. She tried to explain to Jiwoo that they needed to change their entire approach. Instead of waiting for attacks and responding defensively, the Rakthani needed to take the fight to their enemies. But this would require something that had never existed in their culture before. All the scattered packs and settlements would need to work together under unified command. The elder understood the implications immediately. Rakthani packs were independent and proud. Their leaders had never submitted to outside authority. Convincing them to follow orders from another pack would be almost impossible, especially if those orders came through a human alien. But Jiwoo was old enough to remember stories from the ancient past when great threats had forced the Rakthani to unite temporarily. It had not happened in hundreds of years, but the precedent existed. The elder called for messengers to be sent to all the remaining settlements with an invitation to a gathering that had not been held in living memory. Over the following days, Rakthani leaders arrived from across the continent. Ha-Jin watched them enter the settlement and could see immediately why unity would be difficult. Each pack leader was an alpha predator accustomed to being obeyed without question. They moved with the confidence of beings who had never met anything. They could not kill or intimidate. The gathering took place in the largest building in the settlement. Ha-Jin was allowed to attend, but she stayed in the background while the pack leaders argued in voices that could be heard throughout the community. They spoke too fast and used too many complex words for her to follow, but their body language told the story clearly enough. They were not impressed with suggestions that they should work together. One particularly large pack leader that Su-Jin whispered was called Yun-Su seemed especially resistant to cooperation. This female Rakthani was covered in battle scars and carried herself with the absolute authority of someone who had never lost a fight. When she spoke, the other leaders listened, but Ha-Jin could see disagreement in their postures. The arguments continued for 2 days with no progress toward unity. Ha-Jin began to think that the cultural differences were too great to overcome. The Rakthani had survived for thousands of years as independent hunters, and they saw no reason to change now, even when faced with extinction. On the 3rd day, everything changed. A young Rakthani warrior ran into the settlement covered in blood and barely alive. Through gasping words, he reported that Yun-Su's pack had been attacked by the largest Vex force anyone had ever seen. The spider wolves had come in waves numbering in the hundreds, and even the mighty pack leader had been forced to retreat after losing most of her warriors. Worse yet, the survivor reported that some of the attacking Vex had been riding on larger creatures that looked like infected Rakthani. The parasites were not just controlling smaller animals anymore. They had found a way to take over apex predators and turn them against their own kind. The pack leaders fell silent as the implications sank in. If the Vex could control Rakthani, then no pack was safe no matter how strong or isolated. The enemy now had access to all their fighting skills and tactical knowledge. Traditional methods of defense would be useless. Yunwu stood up and looked directly at Ha Jin. In the formal language that all Rakthani understood, he asked her to explain what she thought they should do. The other pack leaders made sounds of surprise and some outright hostility at the idea of taking strategic advice from an alien. Ha Jin took a deep breath and walked to the center of the circle. She had been learning Rakthani words and concepts for months, and while her grammar was terrible, she could make herself understood on important topics. Speaking slowly and carefully, she laid out a plan for unified resistance against the Vex threat. The strategy required each pack to contribute warriors to combined forces that would be larger and more flexible than any individual group. Instead of defending scattered settlements, they would establish fortified positions that could support each other. Most importantly, they would take the offensive and attack Vex colonies before the parasites could spread further. Some of the pack leaders began to nod as they recognized the wisdom in her words, but others remained skeptical, especially about the idea of unified command. Who would lead these combined forces, and why should proud pack leaders take orders from someone else? Ha Jin pointed to Hyunwoo and explained that he had experience working with human tactics and had proven himself in battle against the Vex. But even as she spoke, she could see that this would not be enough. The other pack leaders respected Hyunwoo, but they would not submit to him. At that moment, Eunsu entered the gathering hall. The scarred pack leader moved slowly, and Ha Jin could see bandages covering wounds that must have been serious, even for a Rakthani to acknowledge them. But Eunsu's yellow eyes burned with the fury of someone who had lost pack members to an enemy that could not be fought with traditional methods. The scarred leader listened while the other pack leaders explained what Ha Jin had proposed. Then, Eunsu walked over to where the human stood and studied her with the intensity of a natural predator, evaluating potential prey. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. Finally, Eunsu made a sound that was part growl and part laughter. In the formal language, she announced that the small alien had shown more tactical wisdom in one conversation than most Rakthani learned in a lifetime. The pack leader, who had never submitted to anyone, declared that she would follow Ha Jin's strategic guidance if it would help destroy the Vex. The other pack leaders made sounds of shock and disbelief. If mighty Eunsu was willing to take direction from the human, then perhaps they should reconsider their positions. One by one, they began to agree that unified action was necessary for survival. But Elder Jiwoo raised an important point. The combined forces would need a single commander that all packs would obey without question. This leader would need to understand both traditional Rakthani methods and the new coordinated tactics. Most importantly, they would need the absolute trust and loyalty of warriors from different packs. The debate that followed was unlike anything in Rakthani history. Pack leaders who had never acknowledged equals began seriously discussing who should command their combined forces. Several names were suggested, but each candidate had rivals who would not accept their authority. Finally, Hyunwoo stood and made a speech that stunned everyone present. He pointed out that Ha Jin had already been commanding mixed groups successfully. Warriors from different backgrounds followed her tactical guidance because she had proven her wisdom in battle. She understood the enemy better than anyone, and had developed strategies that worked. More importantly, Ha Jin was not Rakthani, which meant she had no traditional enemies or rivals among the packs. Warriors could follow her orders without feeling that they were submitting to competing alphas. She was outside their normal social structure, which made her the perfect choice for unprecedented. 3 years had passed since Ha Jin fell from the sky onto Zarian Prime, and the planet was no longer the same world it had been. The red forests now showed signs of careful management with new growth patterns that supported both Rakthani settlements and the recovering ecosystem. Bioluminescent communication networks linked communities across continents, allowing for coordination that would have been impossible in the old days of isolated packs. Ha Jin stood on the command deck of the Crimson Fang, watching the stars through bioengineered viewing ports that the Rakthani had grown specifically for space travel. The massive ship was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. It combined Rakthani biotechnology with human engineering principles to create vessels that were part machine and part living organism. Around her moved the crew that had become her family over the years of war against the Vex. Sujin served as her primary tactical advisor and had evolved into one of the most brilliant military minds on the planet. Minho commanded the ship's warriors with skills that combined traditional Rakthani fighting methods with human strategic thinking. Yunsu had become her most trusted lieutenant, and the scarred pack leader's absolute loyalty had helped unite even the most stubborn communities. Elder Jiwoo had not lived to see the final victory over the Vex, but the old Rakthani's wisdom had guided them through the darkest days of the war. Before dying peacefully in the settlement that had become the planetary capital, Jiwoo had performed the ritual that officially named Ha-Jin as Queen of all Rakthani packs. The ceremony had been witnessed by representatives from every community on the planet. The war itself had been brutal and costly, but human tactics combined with Rakthani ferocity had proven unstoppable. Ha-Jin had taught her warriors to think like pack hunters on a planetary scale. They learned to coordinate massive operations across multiple continents and to adapt their strategies based on enemy responses. The Vex parasites that had seemed so intelligent individually could not match the collective intelligence of unified Rakthani forces. More importantly, the war had changed Rakthani society in fundamental ways. The need for cooperation had broken down barriers between packs and communities. Warriors who had once fought each other now worked together as naturally as members of the same family. The concept of unified command had become so accepted that most young Rakthani could not imagine the old days of independence and isolation. But the greatest change was in how the Rakthani saw themselves in relation to the galaxy. For thousands of years, they had been content to remain on their homeworld as apex predators ruling their limited domain. Now they understood that there were threats and opportunities among the stars that required their attention. The bioships that surrounded the Crimson Fang were proof of how far they had come. Rakthani biotechnology had always been advanced, but it had never been applied to space travel. Under Ha-Jin's guidance, their engineers had learned to grow vessels that could survive in the vacuum of space while maintaining the living systems that made Rakthani technology so effective. A communication signal reached the ship through the biological network that connected all Rakthani vessels. The message reported that long-range sensors had detected familiar energy signatures approaching the system. Ha-Jin smiled as she recognized the specific readings. The starbound Unity had returned to Zirion Prime exactly as scheduled. She had been expecting this visit for months. Through carefully planned encounters with other galactic species, the Rakthani had let word spread that something extraordinary was happening on the planet that everyone had written off as too dangerous to explore. The stories probably sounded unbelievable to civilized alien species, but curiosity would eventually bring investigators. Captain Tayrim and his crew were about to discover that the Deathworlder girl they had cast out to die had become something that would change their understanding of both humans and Rakthani forever. The starbound Unity entered the system cautiously with shields raised and weapons powered. Ha-Jin could understand their nervousness. The last time they had been here, the system contained only one inhabited planet with primitive apex predators. Now their sensors would be showing a thriving interplanetary civilization with technology they did not recognize. Ha-Jin gave orders for the Rakthani fleet to maintain standard diplomatic formation. 20 bioships arranged themselves around the alien vessel in a pattern that demonstrated overwhelming force while avoiding any overtly threatening gestures. Each ship was crewed by warriors who had been trained in the protocol she had developed for first contact with galactic civilization. Through the biocommunication network, she sent instructions to all ship commanders. They were to remain respectful, but make it clear that this system was now under Rakthani protection. Any hostile actions would be met with immediate and decisive response from creatures who had evolved to be the perfect predators. The starbound Unity tried to hail the Rakthani ships using standard galactic frequencies, but received no response. Ha-Jin wanted the reunion to happen on her terms, and that meant face-to-face contact. She ordered Sujin to prepare a boarding party, using the protocols they had developed for diplomatic missions. The bioship extended living docking tubes that sealed against the alien vessel's hull with perfect environmental integrity. Hajin led her honor guard through passages that pulsed with bioluminescent light toward the airlock that connected to the ship where her journey had begun 3 years earlier. She had chosen her appearance carefully for this meeting. The ritual, armor that marked her as Queen of the Rakthani, was lightweight and flexible but obviously advanced. Patterns of bioluminescent threading showed her rank while demonstrating the level of technology her people had achieved. The ceremonial weapons she carried were clearly functional, but designed more for display than combat. Most importantly, she moved with the confident stride of someone who commanded the absolute loyalty of the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. The nervous young engineer who had been cast out in disgrace no longer existed. In her place stood a leader who had united an entire species and transformed a world. The airlock cycled open, and Hajin stepped aboard the starbound Unity, followed by her honor guard. The corridor beyond was exactly as she remembered it, but now it seemed smaller and more primitive than the living passages of Rakthani bioships. She could hear alarm signals echoing through the ship as the crew realized that unknown aliens had somehow boarded their vessel. Captain Tayrim arrived with a full security detail expecting to confront savage apex predators who had somehow learned space travel. Instead, he found himself facing a human woman in advanced armor, accompanied by Rakthani warriors who moved with disciplined precision. The serpentine captain's scales shifted through several color changes, as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Du-hyun and Bo-Ra pushed through the crowd of security officers and stared at their friend in amazement. They had mourned Hajin for 3 years, believing she had died horribly on the predator world. Seeing her alive and obviously thriving was like witnessing someone return from the dead. Hajin smiled at her old friends but addressed her first words to Captain Tayrim in the formal tone appropriate for diplomatic contact between civilizations. She introduced herself as Queen Hajin of the Rakthani Empire and welcomed the visitors to her domain. The alien captain's translator struggled with concepts like Rakthani royalty and human leadership of apex predator species. Tayrim's scales had turned the pale color that indicated shock and confusion. He tried to speak several times before managing to ask how a human Deathworlder had survived among creatures that killed for sport. His voice carried the same arrogance as before, but now it was mixed with uncertainty and perhaps fear. Hajin explained patiently that his assumptions about both humans and Rakthani had been incorrect. The apex predators were not mindless killers but intelligent beings with a complex culture that valued strength and wisdom. Humans were not primitive Deathworlders, but adaptable survivors who could thrive in any environment. When the two species worked together, they could achieve things that neither could accomplish alone. The proof of her words stood around her in the form of Rakthani warriors who followed her orders with absolute discipline. Sujin stepped forward and spoke in careful galactic standard, explaining that her queen had taught them to see beyond their homeworld. The Rakthani were now ready to take their place among the civilized species of the galaxy. Minho added that they had been monitoring galactic communications and were aware of various conflicts and problems that plagued interstellar civilization. The Rakthani Empire was prepared to offer their services as peacekeepers and protectors for species that needed assistance against threats they could not handle alone. Yun-Su remained silent, but her presence spoke volumes. The scarred pack leader was living proof that even the most traditional Rakthani had accepted human leadership. If warriors like her could follow Hajin, then clearly something extraordinary had happened on this world. Captain Tayrim looked around at the disciplined aliens and realized that his understanding of the galaxy had just been shattered. The primitive planet he had used as a dumping ground for unwanted crew members had become the heart